Hello, this lesson is for my college biology students to review the diversity of life. Our next group is invertebrate animals, my personal favorite. Well, my favorites change all the time. Depending on the day, I love invertebrates. Their distinguishing features, they're multicellular, heterotrophic, and their cells lack cell walls. That's the defining features of animals. Invertebrate animals also lack a backbone. Now let me present the phylogeny of the major animal phyla. This is a chart that shows that. Good evidence that they evolved from a protozoan type of ancestor. One of the first things that happened is they became multicellular and motile. So all animals are able to move at least during some stage of their life cycle. Sponges, their defining feature is that they have a protein called spongin, and they have these sharp spicules to deter organisms from eating them. The next evolutionary change was to develop tissue layers. See, sponges have no true tissues and no organs, but cnidarians, which are things like jellyfish and sea anemones and corals, they have tissues and organs. Now, their tissues derive from two tissue layers. They also are radially symmetric, and nematocysts are the stinging cells that are found on jellyfish and sea anemones. Now the next evolutionary change was to develop a third tissue layer. Those three tissue layers are important in embryology. The ectoderm develops into the skin, the nerves, the brain, and the things that are close to the surface of the body. Ecto means outside. Mesoderm, the muscles, the bones, the blood, the things that are in the middle. And the endoderm develops into the lining of the gut. And bilateral symmetry developed, which means that these animals are mirror images, right and left half mirror images of each other. And our simplest of those animals are the flatworms. Then roundworms developed, and they have a little more complex, they have a simple type of body cavity called a pseudocoelom, but a true body cavity called a coelom is a space surrounded by the mesoderm. That was this group of animals that evolved. And we're going to break them into two main groups, protostomes and deuterostomes. And that has to do with the embryological development of the rear end and the mouth. For animals that the mouth develops first, those are the protostomes. If the rear end develops first and the mouth later, those are deuterostomes. So our main groups of deuterostomes are the echinoderms, which are things like sea urchins, sea stars, sand dollars, sea cucumbers. Their defining features are tube feet and a water vascular system. They have no blood. Instead, they pump water through their bodies and use that water pressure to extend little suction cup tube feet. And the other deuterostome phylum is the chordates, the majority of which are vertebrate animals, which we'll talk about later. They developed segmentation, or you could think of it as segmentation developed back here, and then the echinoderms have lost that segmentation in the adult form and become a type of radially symmetric again. But the chordates, the defining features of chordates are that they have a dorsal nerve cord, so that's the spinal cord that runs down your back, a notochord, which is a cartilaginous rod that develops and later is replaced by the vertebrae bones, pharyngeal slits, which are slits in the pharynx or the throat area, which in some of the chordates, like fish, become the gill slits, and then the tail. As long as they have those four traits at some time during their life cycle, they're classified as chordates. As far as the protostomes, the main phyla here are the mollusks, and their defining features are an outer skin called a mantle that produces a calcium carbonate shell. Mollusks are things like squid, octopus, clams, and oysters, seashells, snails, slugs. They don't have distinct segmentation, so segmentation evolves. And again, we can think of it as either segmentation evolved down here and was lost in this branch of the echinoderms and lost a little in the mollusks, or it evolved twice. Examples of segmented worms are real familiar as earthworms and also leeches. And the arthropods, which are defined by having jointed appendages and a chitin exoskeleton that they shed and have to grow larger each time they shed their exoskeleton. Arthropods are by far the largest phylum with the most number of species. Those are animals like crustaceans, like crabs, lobsters, shrimp, arachnids like spiders and ticks and scorpions, millipedes, centipedes, and insects. So you can see that their ecologic and economic importance is huge. They're keystone species in lots of food chains. They serve as pollinators, They're detritivores by breaking down and recycling nutrients into ecosystems. They're important as water quality indicators depending on what species live in the water. They are food. Many of them are pests. They're disease vectors. It's hard to overstate their ecological and economic importance. So here's just some examples of them. Examples of arthropods. And then just to give you a graphical representation of all classified species. And this is difficult because, it's hard to pinpoint how many species have been described since there's various journals that they're published in. But this gives you an overall idea. Most of this other are some of the protists, archaic. Flowering plants, of course, the largest group of plants. But when we look at other invertebrates, mollusks is the second largest phylum, and it's not even close to the arthropods. But insects alone are almost half of all living organisms on the planet by number of species. It's hard to overstate the importance of insects. The sheer variety and wonder of it is amazing. So now we get to the vertebrate animals, the ones that people are most familiar with. The distinguishing features of vertebrates, first of all, they're chordates. So they have all four characteristics of chordates: dorsal nerve cord, notochord, pharyngeal slits in the throat, and a tail. And you say, well, people don't have that. But when we're embryos, remember we start out with a little tail and pharyngeal slits that fill in. The tail dissolves away. Notochord eventually replaced by a vertebrae. And realize that most chordates are vertebrates. Here's a phylogeny of the vertebrate animals. Again, starting at the bottom with ancestral chordates, vertebrae being, our defining feature. So we have the first group is the jawless fish. Next, jaws evolved and gill slits, and we have cartilaginous fish, which are things like sharks and rays and skates. Then bony fish, which is by far the largest of the classes of vertebrate animals, the most species of bony fish. To give you a comparison, there's a few, maybe a dozen or so species of jawless fish, a few hundred cartilaginous fish, 5,000-6,000 species of amphibians and reptiles and mammals, maybe 8,000, 9,000 species of birds. There's over 50,000 species of bony fish. So it's a huge class, obviously a very good design for bodies in water. They have bony scales and bones for protection, but despite the bones being heavier than water, they're able to regulate their depth in the water by use of an air bladder. They can pump oxygen in or out of this air bladder to rise in the water column or sink. So they're very maneuverable, and they have coverings over their gills called opercula that can move to help circulate the water over their gills to get food and oxygen. The next group, the amphibians, they have a smooth skin with mucus glands and often poison glands, but they lost the scales, the bony scales of the fish as part of their evolution, and then evolved lungs and also legs. So amphibians were the first group of legged vertebrate animals. Then we have reptiles, and they're the first group that evolved amniotic eggs. An amniotic egg is an egg that has the embryo surrounded by a sac of water and a yolk to provide nutrients and a hard shell to protect it. So it's really a great way to survive on land. And so you can also see, similar to the transition that plants had from life in water to life on the land, you see a similar thing happening with the evolution of vertebrate animals. Amphibians are partially dependent on the water. They have to lay eggs still in the water or in moist environments, or they dry out. And reptiles, where they have the amniotic eggs and this dry epidermal scales of their skin that are watertight, they can survive on land. Reptiles also developed claws. Then endothermy, or warm-bloodedness, evolved, and a four-chambered heart. Amphibians and reptiles have three-chambered hearts. Fish, two-chambered hearts. Mammals and birds have four chambers, the most efficient type of circulatory system. Now mammals, because of endothermy, they're able to produce body heat, but it also, in order to live in environments where it's cold, they develop hair or fur. They produce milk, that's the defining features of mammals. Mammals also have specialized teeth, incisors, canines, molars. And most mammals give live birth. The embryo receives nutrients from the mother through the placenta, and then the mother eventually gives live birth to a more developed animal. Birds, think of most of the traits of birds, make sense to allow flight. So the development of wings and feathers were a key moment in the evolution of birds. The development of a wishbone, which is the fusion of the two collarbones, and then the keel, which is an elongated, expanded sternum bone to attach the pectoralis flight muscles to allow flight. They also have hollow bones to decrease their weight. They lost teeth, again probably to decrease their weight, and substituted a gizzard, a muscular pouch that they can swallow sharp rocks and use the rocks to grind up their food rather than having teeth. And then they have the most efficient type of respiratory system called parabronchial lungs. Here's some pictures of some of the invertebrate chordates. These two at the bottom are called sea squirts or tunicates. They live in the shallow seacoast and they filter water, and you can see the insides. There's it's kind of a transparent body wall, and you can see inside there's some organs here. But as an embryo, they look very similar to this. This is called a sea pen or a lancelet, and you can see the segmented muscle areas of the body. These were ancestral to the fish. And then here's some examples of fish. This is a hagfish and a lamprey. These are jawless fish. Then the cartilaginous fish, represented by the sharks and rays here. In fact, the largest fish happens to be a cartilaginous fish. That's the whale shark. And then I've shown a coelacanth, which is a type of lobe-finned fish. And then sheer variety of fish is astounding, most of which are ray-finned fishes. Then here's some amphibians. Amphibians are the salamanders and frogs. Reptiles, which include the turtles and tortoises, lizards and snakes, and the crocodiles and alligators. And then the mammals. The variety of mammals is very impressive to us, but again, there's not that as many species. We just are more familiar with them. And birds, which, just as with the plants, these animals make our world a beautiful place. We depend so much on them. Thank you. Hope you learned a lot from this quick overview of the diversity of life on Earth.